Hello, and welcome to the Occupational Safety and Health Authority's training video. Today I will speak about the employer's obligations in managing psychosocial workload. I am Johanna Rajalahti, and I work as Inspector in Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The purpose of enforcement focusing on psychosocial workload is to ensure that workplaces are able to prevent harmful psychosocial workload and that they are able to implement measures to manage harmful workload. In practice, we carry out supervision, otherwise known as enforcement at workplaces, of precisely the issues that I am presenting in this training video. Before we go any further into the employer's statutory obligations, let's start by determining why managing psychosocial workload is important at workplaces. According to the latest statistics by Kela, 10% share of people on sick leave due to mental health disorders is continuing to grow. It's been the most significant diagnosis group for employees aged 16 to 67 who have received sickness allowance, and the most common mental health disorders have been depression and anxiety disorders. Depression and anxiety disorders, then again, may also be affected by harmful psychosocial workload factors. Mental health-related sick leaves can often be long, and the employee's return to work may require special arrangements from the employer. An occupational healthcare partner is often also needed to make adjustments to the work and to help the employee return to work. However, there are also situations where an employee's work ability may no longer return to the level it was at before sick leave, and they cannot return to the same job that they took sick leave from. And sometimes the situation can even lead to premature retirement. Training video focuses on the employer's statutory obligations, and we primarily focus on how harmful workload at workplaces can be prevented or reduced at the level of the entire work community, and on how to find the real causes of the work community's excessive workload and the corrective measures that can be taken to the reduced workload. If you are already familiar with the employer's obligation to investigate and assess hazards at the workplace, you can think of investigating and assessing psychosocial workload as one part of this entity. Managing workload is important, of course, because it's mandatory, but assessment should not be carried out just because the authorities require it. A careful assessment of psychosocial workload has many positive effects for the employer. When the workload is well managed, employees maintain their productivity and the number of sick leaves decreases. This has a direct financial impact, as depending on the sector and work tasks, the cost of one sick leave may be 300 to 600 euros for the employer, depending on the arrangements that the sick leave causes for the employer. When the workload is well managed, this will also improve the employer image. Employers speak in a positive manner about their workplace and word spreads. Employees also stay longer in workplaces where no one has a workload that threatens their health, which means the employer does not lose skilled personnel. The commitment of competent personnel is important for workplaces in all sectors. In other words, it's worthwhile to invest in investigating and assessing the psychosocial workload at a workplace and planning measures as it repays itself in many ways. These refer to factors related to work content, the organization of work, and the social cohesion of the work community, which may cause harmful workloads to employees. These occur in all sectors and in all jobs, and are due to work or the working environment, and it's of no significance who performs the work. Workload factors also vary by job due to the nature of the work and tasks. But not all workloads are harmful or dangerous to the health of employees. For example, short-term peak hours and days are not usually health hazards, and certain times of deadlines or a short-term fast pace of work may actually act as an incentive for some employees. Workload may become harmful to health when it continues for a long time. Employees are no longer able to recover from work during breaks and leaves, or if the workload is repetitive or exceptionally strong. An individual factor causing severe workload can be, for example, a violent situation at work that could pose a risk to the employee's health. In addition, situations often involve the combined effects of workload factors. For example, a large amount of work may not cause harmful workload on its own. But if the work is also involved a large amount of responsibility, like an employee has a great financial responsibility or responsibility for the health or safety of other people, and the work is continuously interrupted, the workload may start to be harmful. In occupational safety and health enforcement, we do not consider the following to be workload factors: issues related to the employer's management work, such as change negotiations or outsourcing of work, or contractual relationships between the employer and employees, such as pay issues, fixed-term employment relationships, or experience of such things as lack of opportunities to progress in one's career. Issues outside work, such as family relationships or challenges arising from reconciling work and leisure, are also not considered psychosocial workload factors. Employees have different preconditions for performing their work, and these may also vary at different stages of their careers. It's a good idea for the employer to keep in mind that when organizing work and providing instructions or guidance, the employer must also take into account the employee's personal preconditions and individual differences. These include such things as the age and health of employees. However, this presentation does not go further into mapping the situation of individual employees or the adjustment of an individual employee's work. Instead, I'll provide information at the level of general risk and hazard assessment. Of course, general measures that aim to support employees experiencing excessive workload should be planned in advance, for example, in a workplace's early support or intervention model. But I will talk about these risk assessment measures a little later. Let's talk about investigating and assessing psychosocial hazards. Investigating and assessing psychosocial workload factors is not voluntary for the employer. It's a statutory obligation they must carry out. Section 10 of the Occupational Safety and Health Act obligates the employer to investigate all psychosocial workload, risks and hazards related to the work and working conditions, and if this cannot be eliminated, the employer must also assess their significance for the safety and health of the employees at the workplace in question. As we can see from the section's text, this analysis and assessment must be carried out in sufficiently systematic manner, meaning it must take into account all the different tasks, work stages, and professional groups at the workplace. In practice, the investigation and assessment of psychosocial workload factors is carried out at the workplace in the same way as the working environment safety factors should be investigated and assessed. Section 10 also specifies the factors to be taken into account in this investigation and assessment, which comprehensively cover potential hazards and risks related to the work premises, and other working conditions. Paragraph 1 includes a reference to Chapter 5 that concerns more detailed references to such things as ergonomics, physical, mental, and social loading, as well as exposure to chemical, physical, and biological agents. This chapter also contains provisions related to the working environment, the safety of machinery and other equipment, and the prevention of risk of accidents. The amendment to Section 10 of the Occupational Safety and Health Act which entered into force on 1st of June 2023, gives a detailed definition of what psychosocial workload factors mean. In other words, all three different dimensions were described in detail in paragraph 4. These three dimensions are the workload factors related to the content of work arrangements, and the social cohesion of the work community. In addition, aging was added to the third paragraph as a personal precondition to be taken into account. The employer's obligation to investigate and assess workload factors, including psychosocial workload factors, can be described in this process chart as 4 different stages. Identification of workload factors, assessment of their significance to health, planning and implementation of measures, and monitoring of the effectiveness of the measures taken. In order for the process to be effective and serve the workplace itself, meaning both the employer and the employees, each phase of the process should be carried out carefully, and the entire process should also be completed. Next, we will review these steps one by one. As I said before, the wording of Section 10 is based on the fact that workload factors should be investigated in a sufficiently systematic manner. In other words, different workload factors should be investigated comprehensively in the identification process, not only those that have, as far as is known, already caused workload at the workplace. Comprehensive investigation means that identification must include the review of all the different work tasks and phases, task entities, professional groups at the workplace. It's understandable that, for example, customer service tasks, expert tasks, or supervisory tasks may have very different psychosocial workload factors that may cause a health hazard or risk to the worker. These may also differ greatly between workplaces or even at an individual workplace. It's also important to remember that the so-called root causes that result in harmful workload should be identified in the investigation. For example, if continuous interruptions are identified as a workload factor in an individual work task, it's a good idea to look deeper and to find out what causes these interruptions. Are there underlying causes related to the working environment, such as disturbing noise experience in an open plan office, or to the job description itself, such as focusing on customer calls that interrupt other work? Or, for example, the abundance of existing communication channels and unclear instructions on these. This will have a significant impact in risk assessment on what measures the employer must plan to manage interruptions that cause harmful workload. Understandably, the measures that are effective for eliminating the above-mentioned root causes vary a great deal. Noise-cancelling headphones are not a solution to all of these. This is a good example of how the employee's views on the hazards and workload factors related to their own work should be used in determining the risks. Different checklists and questionnaires can be used to identify psychosocial workload factors. For example, there's a risk assessment handbook on the Center of Occupational Safety's website that employers can use, and a separate form related to psychosocial workload factors. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration's website also contains a survey on psychosocial workload factors, which maps the employees' experiences on how often they have experienced harmful workload in their work over the past 6 months resulting from psychosocial workload factors. However, when using form templates, it should be noted that these must not steer the process too much. Sometimes the investigation of root causes of psychosocial workload factors requires that we go deeper than form templates. For example, identifying challenges related to such things as shift work or cognitive work, the processing of information as background factors that cause psychosocial workload, in other words, the root causes. While job satisfaction and workplace climate surveys regularly carried out at many workplaces can also be used to assist in identification, it's advisable to pay attention to what is asked in them. Can the employer draw conclusions on workload factors and assess their significance to health on the basis of the results? Interviews with personal representatives and performance appraisals are also excellent ways to investigate psychosocial workload factors. Of course, working time records and monitoring the number of travel days provides the employer with important information on the psychosocial workload possibly experienced by an employee with a mobile job description. The systematic identification of psychosocial workload factors, as well as all other work-related hazards, risks, and workload factors, may seem laborious and time-consuming at least for the first time it's done. But once the identification process has been carried out truly once, its regular update, for example annually, is usually faster. Workload factors may change, for example, with the reorganization as work practices or the number of employees changes, and also when a supervisor changes. This should be kept in mind so that the employer can comply with the provision in Section 10, obligating them to keep the investigation and assessment up to date. Once the workload factors have been identified, and if they cannot be eliminated, that is, prevented in advance, the employer must in some manner assess their significance to the health of employees at the workplace. The assessment must be carried out for all identified workload factors, which means each of them must be assessed separately. The assessment of the significance to health prioritizes the risks. What does the assessment of significance to health mean in practice? In this context, we often talk about assessing the magnitude of the risk. The purpose of assessing the magnitude of the risk is for the employer to identify those workload factors that require urgent action to reduce the risk, and those factors that do not need to be prioritized. The higher the magnitude of the risk, the sooner the employer must take measures to reduce the risk. On the other hand, the assessment may also show that the existing arrangements are sufficient to manage the identified workload factors. Not all identified workload factors will necessarily pose a health hazard to an employee, as was previously noted at the beginning of the presentation. Different indicators and the methods are also available for assessing the health-related significance of psychosocial workload factors. The workplace can also decide on the way in which it will carry out the assessment. It's fundamental that the assessment criteria are defined as clearly as possible so that they can also be used to monitor possible changes in the level of risk. In addition, the magnitude of the risk, meaning the level of risk, should be expressed sufficiently clearly, whether it's numerical, verbal, color-coded, or in some other form. Risk magnitude is calculated in the Center of Occupational Safety's risk assessment handbooks from templates, which I mentioned earlier, with a 5-step model that cross-tabulates the probability of an incident and the severity of its consequences. If, on the other hand, the employer uses the Occupational Safety and Health Authority's Psychosocial Workload Factors Survey as a form of risk assessment, the employer must remember to assess how often these workload factors are realized at the workplace. It's good to be aware that simply commissioning the survey without actually analyzing the results is not yet an assessment of psychosocial workload. If necessary, the assessment can also be carried out in cooperation with occupational health care. Assessing the health significance of workload factors may be challenging, as it's typical of most workload factors that their potential health hazards will only be realized in the long term. The symptoms caused by excessive workload may also vary greatly between employees, as everyone is a unique individual. The assessment is a general risk assessment, meaning an assessment of the likelihood of the identified workload factors causing psychological or physical harm to the health of workers. It's also important to assess health significance of workload, because if it's not done, measures at the workplace to reduce workload may simply focus on matters that do not necessarily affect employees' health and that seem easy to implement in principle. Next, I would like to speak about the role of occupational healthcare and support for the employer if necessary. According to occupational healthcare legislation, occupational healthcare is tasked with determining how healthy and safe work and working conditions are, assessing the health significance of the conditions, and proposing measures to the employer with which to improve the working conditions. This task is usually carried out in the form of workplace surveys. In practice, occupational healthcare workplace surveys are carried out every 3 to 5 years. However, significant changes may occur in an employee's work over a period of 5 years, which will have a significant impact on the psychosocial workload experienced at work. In this case, it may be necessary to examine the situation with occupational healthcare before the next survey is due in accordance with the action plan. The workplace survey and the employer's own risk assessment often go hand in hand and can complement one another. However, while the employer may feel the workplace is able to identify psychosocial workload factors, they do not have sufficient competence or expertise to assess the workload. Under the Act, the employer may use external experts to assist in the assessment. The most obvious choice for this task is a workplace's own occupational health care. Occupational health care is an expert in healthcare and is familiar with the workplace and its conditions. Occupational health care is also aware of the most typical workload factors in the sector, especially a situation where excessive workload at a workplace has been identified as continuing for a long period of time or is considered significant, will usually also requires the view of occupational healthcare services on which workload factors have a particularly harmful effect on the health of employees. What kind of health hazards these may cause, and what's the probability that there will be a risk to the health of employees, unless changes take place at the workplace. With the help of occupational healthcare experts, the employer will be able to target its measures at the most significant health hazards in the workplace, and the employer will also receive through recommendations on the measures required. The employer must then decide, in cooperation with occupational healthcare, what methods will be used to investigate and assess the situation in their specific workplace. With regard to workplace surveys, the employer is of course the party responsible for ensuring that workplace surveys are carried out and that written survey documents are available to employees. The employer is also responsible for ensuring that the surveys are up to date. Being up to date does not merely mean that the employer ensures that the surveys are carried out at an interval of 3 to 5 years as agreed in the action plan. It's essential to note that if significant changes take place in the workplace that have an impact on the workload or working conditions, the workplace survey must be updated earlier than planned. A significant change may involve the move at the workplace to new premises, but it may also mean an organizational change that may have an impact on the division of work, the clarity of tasks and roles, or other operating methods decided by the employer. When a risk assessment is updated at the workplace frequently enough, changes in the work community's workload are identified and so the need to update the workplace survey is also taken into account. For occupational healthcare to be able to act as the employer's expert in the assessment of psychosocial workload, it of course needs sufficient information from the employer on working conditions. It's important that the employer and occupational healthcare implement the workplace survey together. It should not be a survey solely drawn up by occupational healthcare. The employer is actually responsible for ensuring the coverage of the workplace survey. This sometimes comes as a surprise to workplaces in the context of occupational safety and health enforcement. If the employer feels that the workplace survey is not providing sufficient information on the impact of risks to employees present in the workplace, the employer is obligated to request the occupational healthcare provider to supplement the survey. This again may require that the employer to provide more information on the situation at the workplace to occupational healthcare. In other words, it's necessary to invest in occupational healthcare cooperation so the employer can be informed of the working conditions at the workplace, require changes or improvements due to the health risk to employees. If occupational healthcare provides proposals for measures to manage harmful workloads, the employer should take them into account and implement them as far as possible. However, they do not need to be the only measures implemented. The employer can also plan and implement other measures for managing psychosocial workload. The employer has a comprehensive understanding of the situation at the workplace and the measures that can be implemented at the workplace. Let's return to the employee's responsibility to investigate and assess psychosocial risks and what the employer should take into account before taking measures to reduce psychosocial workload. In other words, what needs to be taken into account? First, it should be noted that under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the management of workload is not just about intervening in situations where the employee is already exhausted. Preventive measures must be taken at workplace to prevent exhaustion from occurring. This is the key purpose of assessing psychosocial hazards and the reason why an assessment is carried out. As I mentioned earlier, in an example with continuous interruptions and the identification of root causes, the risks must indeed be identified in sufficient detail so that the measures can be planned at all. If the workload factor has been vaguely defined as work-related stress, it's really difficult for the employer to plan corrective measures if they do not know what's causing the stress. Measures should always begin with the workload factors that pose the most significant risk to the health of employees. In other words, the factors with the highest risk score or the factors that occupational healthcare has considered to cause the most significant health hazard or harm. If the measures are not targeted at actual workload factors, the experience of workload is not reduced. If the workplace finds that a system not for ordering goods or services is not working efficiently, or their stock balances are inaccurate, and they determine that the reason is that employees are not aware who is responsible for these tasks or how the systems are used, it can be understood that the employees' experience of harmful workloads will not be reduced by purchasing new computers and systems. Instead, the situation will require clarification of work roles and induction of work tasks. One of the most important things to keep in mind when planning measures is, of course, the correct order of measures in accordance with Section 8 of the Occupational Safety and Health Act. What then is the correct order? For each risk identified as harmful, it should first and foremost be considered whether the factor causing the workload can be eliminated and how. If elimination is possible, it must be done. For example, if the harmful workload is caused by continuous telephone calls that interrupt the work, the employer could decide that these employers are no longer responsible for customer services and transfer this to a customer service advisor. However, not all factors causing harmful workload can be eliminated from the workplace, as work could then be impossible. For example, customer service work often involves challenging interactive situations, and in some sectors it even involves the threat of violence. As it's unlikely that customer service can be completely discontinued, it's possible options for the management of workload in some sectors could include the partial electrification of services, limiting customer service hours, job rotation or pair work. These measures can reduce the workers' exposure to situations with harmful workload. If I continue with an example of a threat of violence, it's common knowledge that if there's a threat of violence in the workplace, it may cause stress symptoms and problems with well-being at work for some employees. If violent situations occur at the workplace, this may cause poorer performance and productivity in addition to the above. When there's a threat of violence in the workplace, it's very important that employees are familiarized with how to act in threatening situations, or when violence is already happened, what actions does the employer require? How should the employer behave in the situation, and how can they get help in the situation? When the employee knows how to act in an unpredictable situation, it reduces the harmful workload caused by the situation to the employee. Comprehensive induction and training can also be considered one way of managing psychosocial workload, as it's intended to reduce the psychosocial workload that this situation may cause for the employee. As many factors affect the experience of workload, one of the employees at a workplace may experience workload even if preventive measures have been taken. For this reason, the employer must also plan support practices in advance for employees who will experience excessive psychosocial workload. It's a good idea to create support practices together with the occupational healthcare provider, and they can be predefined, for example, in form of an operating model for early support or intervention at the workplace. Here's one example of correctly targeted measures in a situation where the harmful psychosocial workload is caused by an excessive amount of work or an excessive pace of work. Primarily, measures should focus on the root cause causing psychosocial workload, that is, the fact that there's too much work. Tasks can be organized in a new way, the division of labor can be reviewed, workplace processes can be clarified, and priority can be given to certain tasks, while specifying which tasks can be carried out later, or tasks that can be determined when tasks can be transferred to another professional group. In addition, employees can be provided with methods for management of workload to reduce the health risk caused by psychosocial workload. Various types of training on managing one's own work or on well-being at work and recovery can be used as management methods. Even so, it is important to note that if the employer does not implement these root cause measures mentioned in the first box, the workload caused by an excessive amount of work will not be eliminated by providing workers with training on how to recover from their work in leisure time. Even if an employee invests in recovery during their leisure time, it will not eliminate the fact that every time they come to work, their health is put at risk due to an excessive amount of work, and it's likely they will have to take sick leave sooner or later. A well-performed risk assessment prevents sickness absences. If amount of work is considered to pose a lower risk at the workplace, different management methods, in other words, measures that reduce the impact and monitoring the situations, may be sufficient. However, as I mentioned earlier, individual differences between employees will affect the experience of workload, and employee may experience harmful workload in spite of preventive measures taken by the employer. Measures that focus on negative consequences are measures that will enable employees who have experienced excessive workload to return to work and provide them with better opportunities to continue working while remaining healthy, and this will help eliminate further sick leave. These may include pre-planned cooperation patterns with occupational healthcare, such as the division of tasks between the supervisor and occupational healthcare, different models for returning to work, such as fixed-term reduction in work tasks, partial sickness allowance, or a replacement work model, and so on. Another example is a situation in which employees do not feel that they receive sufficient support for their work from their supervisor, and this becomes a harmful workload factor. The need for supervisor support is particularly emphasized in demanding expert work and in situations where there's a large amount of work. Lack of support affects job satisfaction and can easily lead to an increase in sick leaves. It's important to note that in such situation, supervisors may often also need support. Correct measures to reduce lack of support experienced by employees include defining supervisors' responsibilities, which will ensure that everyone is aware of which task each supervisor is responsible for. It may be necessary to review this with both supervisors and employees. In addition, it should be ensured that supervisors have sufficient resources to carry out their assigned tasks and sufficient competence for the tasks assigned to them. Ready-made supervisory tools, such as Ready Model for conducting a work ability discussion, can also support supervisors and thus reduce the employee's experience of a lack of support. It's also important to note that both new and more experienced supervisors need induction training on the employer's different operating models, especially when the models that are used less frequently. Therefore, it's a good idea to review the operating models intended for the work of supervisors and their use at the workplace from time to time. In this example, the management measures, meaning measures to reduce the impact of workload, include workplace procedures, such as models for reporting and processing harassment or excessive workload. Resource factors, such as collegial support, can also be strengthened at the workplace, and it should be ensured that the roles of occupational safety and health personnel and occupational healthcare providers at the workplace have been agreed in advance so that all parties know who to contact in each situation. In this example as well, it's important to note that if the employer does not focus on the root causes shown in box 1, the employees cannot work with collegial support alone. They also need supervisors' support at the workplace. Now I will tell you about how an employer can determine whether the measures decided on have been sufficient. We will now proceed to monitoring the effectiveness of the measures. That is, we are now in phase 4 of the process described in the figure. According to Section 8 of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the employer is obligated to monitor the impact of implemented measures on the safety and health of work. During this stage of the process, the employer also determines the means by which it will monitor the effectiveness of the measures taken. For the employer to be able to assess whether the measures taken have been sufficient and correctly focused, and whether the workload experienced has decreased after their implementation, it must be considered how this can be measured. This means the employer must decide on the indicators they will use for this. Monitoring is reliable and systematic when performed with agreed effectiveness indicators. For example, if the psychosocial workload factors survey has been used to identify workload factors, it can also be used in monitoring. It may take quite some time before measures intended for psychosocial workload prove effective, and it's worth planning how quickly the significance of the measures should or can be assessed based on the significance of the risk. For example, if the risk has been significant and the measures selected by the employer have been very effective, it should be considered whether the situation can be considered rectified in the few months' time. It's also a good idea to consider what could be signs of an improved situation, and on the other hand, what could be the signs indicating that the situation will not be rectified with the selected measures and additional measures are needed. Monitoring is useful in both situations, even if the situation has not completely improved. Monitoring requires that the risk assessment is carried out in sufficient detail to allow a reliable assessment of the change in the situation. The employer can also utilize their occupational healthcare services in monitoring, for example, by comparing new surveys conducted by occupational healthcare with the results of previous surveys. I have already spoken a great deal about the investigation and assessment of hazards, as that's the basis for workload management. To conclude, however, I'd like to remind you of what else the law requires from the employer in terms of psychosocial workload. It's the employer's duty to provide employees with information on the psychosocial workload factors that occur in the work in question, as well as instruction and guidance on how to avoid these at the workplace. When planning instruction and guidance, the workload factors identified in the psychosocial assessment must be included. The updated Occupational Safety and Health Act also emphasizes the employer's obligation to provide induction training. For example, if a workplace involves a large amount of travel abroad, the employer can provide orientation to employees to help them understand how travel affects health so that they are able to prevent the associated health hazards. Or in database work, employees can be provided with instructions on time management and the use of tools that can be used to manage email loads or their own memory load. The employer must also instruct employees on how to report if they feel they are experiencing excessive workload that could endanger their health and who to report this to. This should usually be reported to a person's supervisor. Instructions for reporting can be provided, for example, in the early support or intervention model, or using a separate notification form or other instructions for handling stress. A workplace must, of course, also plan in advance how a possible report will be processed. And here is worth remembering that the Occupational Safety and Health Act also obligates employees. Employee is obligate to inform the employer if the work causes loading to the employee in such a way that it causes harm or danger to the employee's health. The employer must also ensure that the responsibilities and obligations of supervisors have been described in sufficient detail at the workplace. Supervisors must also have the appropriate prerequisites for performing their duties. This includes ensuring sufficient working time resources and ensuring that supervisors have sufficient knowledge and competence to be able to detect harmful workloads in time. Practices at the workplace must also allow supervisors to monitor the state of the work community and the impacts of work on health so that harmful workload can be detected in sufficient time. I spoke about monitoring of measures with regards to the workplace risk assessment, but the employer must also generally observe the status of the workplace and the work community and also intervene in any deficiencies that have arisen in real time if necessary. Employees can begin to experience harmful psychosocial workload, for example in situations where there are significant changes in the work, such as new large customer relationships, changes are made to working methods, or substantial changes are made to the working conditions or tools. In this case, it may be necessary to start the update of the psychosocial workload assessment and planning of measures earlier than originally planned. Before the conclusion of the training video, here are some tips on where to find more support for managing psychosocial workload. For example, the Psychosocial Workload Factors survey that I spoke about earlier can be used to identify workload factors. The survey is on our website at työsuojelu.fi. The survey will help you recognize the types of workload factors that occur at your workplace. And then you can brainstorm on what kind of brush or rake is needed to rid your workplace of them.